I know there's a few others out there. I know they're trying to get things wrapped up, so we'll go ahead and get started and then catch up. So we finished last week's, which was lesson 8 on, well, we didn't finish it, but we finished it. We're moving on. So it's on the subject of creation versus evolution, with the idea being that creationism deserves a rational look just as much as evolution does. And so we're not afraid of that at all, because the evidence, the logic, the philosophical reasoning all points towards Creator. So we don't have a problem with that. We just want a chance to be heard. And so that was the essence of that, which is good. Oh, you already got one? Well. Which is good, because we need that kind of information for the arguments which we discussed in our earlier lessons. So thus far, we've established an excellent case, I believe, for the reality of a theistic universe. So when we say theistic universe, what do we mean? Yeah, it's one where there is the reality of the supernatural, something outside of the natural, of the material. So we've established that case, I believe, and then that when we talk about a theistic universe, it's a universe created by someone outside of the material universe. The cosmological argument, the teleological argument, and the moral argument for the existence of God, they all reveal evident characteristics of this Creator, right? So we talked about these evident characteristics. It would include the idea of being timeless, immaterial, spaceless, all-powerful, all-knowing, personal, volitional, good, eternal, infinite, and there's others. Now, the contingent universe necessarily needs a non-contingent being, or starter, or first cause, the uncaused cause, the first cause, a supernatural cause. And so we believe the supernatural includes the Creator God, because of the sciences of the things we talked about, like that have to deal with the astrophysics that we talked about, and also the science of biochemistry that we discussed in the teleological argument. But we need to ask this question: who exactly is this Creator God? Because right now there's other non-Christian worldviews who would agree with us. Who would that be? Yeah, the Muslims, they would be fine with this, with the theistic universe that we've established so far. And so now we need to be able to make the case, and we need to ask the question: who exactly is this Creator God? The scientific evidence in itself cannot identify Him. So what we've done so far is good to help somebody get to the point of understanding that there's something more than the natural, that there's a supernatural entity of some kind, and we need to narrow it down. So our point here, though, is that this Creator is Yahweh. That's who we want to establish. The God who reveals Himself to us in the Bible. But what is the evidence that establishes this as a fact? Why do we believe that the Creator God is the God of the Bible, the God of our Lord Jesus Christ? And the bottom line is this: we believe that the Creator God is the God of the Bible because Jesus arose from the dead. Now, that sounds simple enough, right? Jesus arose from the dead, therefore the God of the Bible is the one true Creator God. But we need to wait a minute here. We need to think for a second. As you might expect, the argument is a really bit more complicated than that. Before we can reach that conclusion, the conclusion, the God of the Bible is the one true Creator God, we have to answer two very specific and very important questions of apologetics. And those two questions are going to be the subjects of our next two lessons, Lesson 9, Lesson 10. It's probably going to take us anywhere between 3 and 5 weeks to get through both these lessons, because there's a lot here. So those two questions are this. Firstly, what we're going to look at beginning tonight: what proves the resurrection? what proves the resurrection. And then, once we've established that, we're going to ask the question, what does the resurrection prove? Now, in this lesson, we are focusing only on the first of these questions. Now, if we're going to use the resurrection of Jesus to prove this central Christian truth about the existence of God, then we are first going to have to prove that the resurrection actually occurred. That's our goal in this lesson. Here we are asking this: what is the evidence that Jesus arose from the dead? What evidence is there? What reason? What logic? What evidence? And so that's our task. So as we do this, first we ask the question, what kind of evidence shows that Jesus arose? So what kind of evidence? So when we've been doing these, the cosmological argument, teleological moral argument, you've been engaging in philosophical practices there. I don't know if you know. Now the Bible says to avoid philosophy, but it specifically says to avoid bad philosophy. Meaning then what? Yeah, it implies that there's actually good philosophy out there. A good philosophy that leads us towards the God of the Bible and gives us a foundation for that. There's nothing wrong with that. But we got to avoid the philosophies of men, the stuff that leads us away from that. And so we've engaged in philosophical, logical reason. We're using the tools of logic. We've looked at science, empirical evidence. And so we have to ask ourselves, what kind of evidence are we going to look at here to show that Jesus arose? Now for us, it's not the evidence of experience nor the evidence of science. Rather, it is the evidence of history. So it's the discipline and the practice of history. Very important. Now, like so much of the Bible, of the biblical records, the event of the resurrection was a historical event, or so it is claimed. That means we must treat it like any other alleged historical event, i.e. we must analyze the claims of those who lived and observed and wrote in the historical context of the resurrection, and we must show that there is good historical proof that it really happened. So now we're moving from philosophers to historians in the way that we're going to approach this. Now in this regard, about history, this is important. Christianity is unlike most world religions because most of them are not dependent upon or are not intertwined with actual human history. So other world religions that are out there are not dependent upon history or not intertwined with history. So the Christian Bible, though, especially the first part of the Old Testament and the first part of the New Testament, is packed solid with what are claimed to be historical records. And the validity of these historical records is crucial to the validity of the Christian faith as a whole. This applies especially to the gospel records about Jesus Christ. So that is going to be the focus of our attention, is on the gospel records. When we understand those of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the accounts therein is going to be the focus of the history that we're looking at here. Now, when we examine these records, just as we would any other alleged historical claims, these records prove to be amazingly trustworthy. They prove to be reliable where it is possible to test them against other contemporary information, such as that uncovered by archaeological research. Also, the record possesses an internal harmony and what has been called a ring of truth, to quote J.B. Phillips. Also, as we saw in our earlier lessons, there are no legitimate a priori objections to the possibility of miraculous supernatural events. So we understand that the greatest miracle occurred, which is creation ex nihilo. Then that makes possible all other miracles. The reality of miracles is possible because creation ex nihilo, out of nothing, sets the standard for, well, we live in a universe where miracles do exist and are possible. Now, so what then is a specific positive evidence for the resurrection of Christ, approaching the biblical records simply as historical documents. Now, this can be difficult for us that have been Christians for a long time, right? Because what is your overall view of this book? Well, okay, we regard it as Christians as the completely inerrant, infallible Word of God, right? And so it's inspired, and so that's how we look at it. What I'm asking for us to do here is to look at it simply as a historical record for the purposes of this study. Think of it from the purposes of a historical record, book of history. And you'll see why that's important here in a little bit. See, Christian apologists agree that from the standpoint of the sheer weight of the evidence, the resurrection of Jesus is the best attested historical fact in all of human history. You can see there's a lot of books. I have quite a few of these on my shelf if you want to do further study on this. Josh McDowell has a book called The Resurrection Factor. He also has a great book written with Sean McDowell. His son, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, is loaded with evidence about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. William Lane Craig's written. There's tons of research that's been done. And one more, Gary Habermas and Michael Licona, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. Now, Gary Habermas, he is right now considered the probably the number one historian on the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And I think Eric informed me. Eric's actually had emails back and forth with him on some stuff. They're buddies. And so he said that he is on his work that he's done now, compiling evidence, historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ, somewhere in the 6,000 to 7,000 page range on his next publication. 6,000 to 7,000 pages of historical documentation of the historicity of Jesus Christ. Habermas? Yeah. Yeah, and Eric knows them, so they're buddies. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's pretty cool, I would say, because there's somebody else, too, that he's had conversations with, and I'm like, man, you're famous. You know famous people. So, who else is it? Oh, I'll think of it. Who? Who'd you say? Oh, yeah, Darnell Ferguson, yeah. So there's that guy, I don't know if you've seen, he's been all over Food Network, has a couple of restaurants in Louisville called, he calls himself Darnell Super Chef Ferguson. He's been all over Food Network. He's becoming quite famous. And he has Darnell's number and they text. So, or they did. I don't know if they still do. Darnell might have blocked him. But anyway, actually he was helping with our VBS on some ideas about when we were doing the last VBS, which is pretty cool. Now, so anyway, there's tons of stuff out there right now on the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Lee Strobel's got good stuff. Frank Turk, there's whatever you want, it's there. There's tons of stuff you can read and study. Now, let's talk about the nature of the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus as one of the clearest and most persuasive rules of logic. Now, we've already talked about this. And that's called the principle of sufficient cause. So any event or effect must have a cause that is sufficient to explain it. Guys, remember we talked about this? And so this applies to the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so we need to think about there has to be sufficient cause for certain effects. And so we're going to look at the effects here in a little bit. That's going to be the way we're going about it. So any event or effect must have a cause that is sufficient to explain it. Now, people apply this rule every day. A dead body is found. How can we explain the death? Why did my car stop running? What is causing this pain in my abdomen? Why did Brother Jones stop coming to church? There has to be sufficient cause. Now, in such cases, we are looking for the cause that makes the most sense and explains the most data. The same is true of the reports of the resurrection of Jesus. So we're going to focus on this concept of the reports, the testimony of the resurrection of Jesus. How can we explain these reports? The answer that the only explanation that makes sense and accounts for the most data is that Jesus actually rose from the dead, and we're going to show that. There are well-attested historical facts, these reports, that cannot be reasonably explained by anything except the resurrection of Jesus. Now, I'm confident that every single one of you here know this of the Andy Griffith Show here. So, depending on some of our younger demographic, they've not been exposed to that, and shame on their parents. But anyway, we talk about the Andy Griffith Show. So we're going to have an example here of a sufficient cause, an episode from the Andy Griffith Show. So there's one day on one of these episodes, little Opie comes into the sheriff's office with this report. He says, "There's a new man in town. I met him in the woods." Andy and Barney reply, "Well, that's fine. What's his name?" At this point, they have no doubt that Opie's telling the truth. Opie answers, "His name is Mr. McBeevy. And you know what? He walks around in the treetops and wears a great big shiny silver hat." Now, Andy and Barney become skeptical. Then Opie shows them a hatchet and says, "Mr. McBeevy gave it to me." Now, Andy is not just skeptical, but he's also clearly irked. He thinks Opie made up the story to explain the hatchet. He completely disbelieves the story about Mr. McBeevy and offers other explanations for Opie's possession of the hatchet. "Well, you just picked it up along the road." "No." "Well, it came from Mr. Ettinger's carpenter shop." "No." "If you found it in the woods, somebody obviously left it there, and we'll be back for it, so you take it back." Now, Opie reluctantly returns it and has further conversation with his new friend. Then he comes back and tells Andy and Barney more facts about Mr. McBeevy. When he walks, he sort of jingles, like he had rings on his fingers and bells on his toes. And he has 12 extra hands helping him from his belt. Also, he can make smoke come out of his ears. He learned this from the cannibals. And he gave me this quarter. Now, Andy is really mad at Opie at this point. The only explanation for Opie's story, he thinks, is you're just plain lying. It's all make-believe. Barney sums it up. How can you explain it all? Now, that is just the issue. If Opie's story is true, how can you explain it all? Remember, a main rule of logical and historical thinking is this: every effect must have a sufficient cause, a sufficient explanation. Here, the effect that demands a sufficient cause is Opie's story about Mr. McBeevy, especially in view of the fact that Opie is truthful, honest, conscientious little boy. So we take into account that Opie was an honest little feller. So does Opie's story have an explanation that is sufficiently consistent with all the facts? Yeah. As the story has unfolded all along, Mr. McBeevy is a telephone lineman with lots of jingly tools. So he does have a shiny hat, works up on the poles, and is in the sky, and all the things he said. It was just communicated from an interesting point of view. Now, our argument here is this: the only sufficient cause for certain incontestable effects described in the gospel accounts is the resurrection of Jesus. As Louis Cassels has said, quote, "The Christian explanation for why Jesus is remembered at all is that something very extraordinary happened after Jesus was put to death. If the story seems hard to believe, it's even harder to come up with an historically plausible alternative." It is important to realize that the written documents which contain the reports of Jesus' resurrection from the dead have a real history and represent themselves as reporting real historical events that happen at particular times and places in real history. They must be approached first. So again, this is what we were saying, so don't throw rocks. They must be approached first. These facts, these historical documents must be approached first of all, not as special documents divinely inspired by the Holy Spirit, which we know they are, but as historical documents that can and should be analyzed and critiqued for truth in the same way that all other historical documents are analyzed and critiqued. It is just such a historical examination that establishes the reality and trustworthiness of the various testimonies and reports concerning events related to the resurrection of Jesus. So, all that said, what are the accepted historical events that serve as the uncontested effects for which only the resurrection is a sufficient cause? And so the first effect that we're going to look at is the reports concerning the empty tomb. That's the first thing we're going to see here. The effect is that there were multiple reports of an empty tomb. The first effect that demands a sufficient explanation is the testimony or reports from eyewitnesses that the tomb in which the crucified Jesus was buried on Friday was found empty on Sunday morning. We are talking about the disciples' reports concerning the empty tomb. Now, this is the effect for which the resurrection is the only reasonable explanation. See, many frame this argument by saying that the empty tomb itself is the effect that demands the explanation, but in our judgment, this is very close to the logical fallacy of begging the question or assuming the conclusion needs to be proved. Now, I think it's better to say that the effect that demands an explanation is simply this: the reports that the tomb was empty. So we're focusing on the reports. So how can such attestation be explained? See, unbelievers have offered some different arguments as that there are many other plausible explanations that make sense of such reports. So those who do not believe in Jesus as the Son of God, that he was resurrected, say, well, there's other reasonable explanations, and so they offer certain ideas. So we're going to look at some of those ideas. So there's three standard objections. Begin with the claim that the disciples who said that the tomb was empty were simply lying. That they were lying. That all these reports were basically just deceit and lying. Such an explanation is completely inconsistent with other data found in the documents. However, found in the other dockets, however. Now, first, the telling of a lie would have been contrary. Now, this is something that is interesting to think about. Go back to Opie, right? One of the first things why they would believe Opie was because of his character. And so we consider the character or the worldview of the people that were involved here. What was the character and the worldview of the people involved in these reports? What was their worldview? What was their belief system? Of the empty tomb, yes?
There were multiple worldviews.
Okay.
You had the worldview of the Roman soldiers who were guarding the tomb. They were pagan, but they had to make up a lie
Okay.
to show us.
Let's look on the positive side of things, though, from the positive reports of the fact that it was a good thing. But yes, that's true. So, go ahead.
We also have confirmation that the worldview of those giving the positive was a Judeo-Christian, what would now be a Judeo-Christian worldview.
Okay, so they were Jewish, right? Their Jewish background. What are in the Jewish belief system? How is lying viewed? Yeah, so it's a high moral ethic, right? A high ethical standard. And so we're talking about these serious believers that were steeped in Old Testament morality, that all of them are going to lie? I mean, I guess it's possible, but we need to consider what they believed to be okay and what was their moral background. See, also such a false report would put these disciples at risk of persecution and even death from Roman and Jewish authorities. Why? If they were lying, why would they do that? It says here that it might put them at risk to the Roman and Jewish authorities. Why would it put them at risk if they were lying? Yeah, so let's say that I'm going to lie about it, but I know that there's certain consequences from the Jewish and the Roman authorities. What would those consequences possibly be? Well, that's another possibility. But as far as lying itself, okay, so there's possibility that they could be detained, convicted, tried, punished for lying, right? Offering false testimony. And so we have to consider that fact too. Would all of them lie with the fact that a false report would put these disciples at risk of persecution and even death from the Roman and Jewish authorities who were sworn enemies of Jesus? Finally, a false report could have been easily disproved, right? If they were lying, and it was just simply lying, then a body that was discovered would have put those lies down, wouldn't it? A false report could have been easily disproved and thus rendered impotent. This did not happen. Now, another standard objection to the empty tomb reports is the claim that the disciples who said the tomb was empty must have gone to the wrong tomb. So this is a legitimate claim that they make, saying, well, they just went to the wrong tomb, all of them. Now, but this attempt to refute the report is also inconsistent with other known facts which show that the disciples were quite familiar with the location of the right tomb. Now, let's just think about this. Was there anything different with what happened to Jesus and maybe some of the other criminals? We know that there were 2 others hung there, right? When they were buried, what do you think the lengths that the Roman officials went to at Jesus' tomb were the same for the other guys? Okay, so what would that have looked like compared to the other places where they might have been? Yeah, it had a seal, yeah, and so also posted guards, right? So how's that going to appear to the onlooker? It's going to stick out like a sore thumb, right? I mean, it's going to stick out. I mean, if you just think of it from a logical perspective. I mean, to be kind of silly, you go to the graveyard, the biggest tombstone. I mean, the one that's like oh wow, that thing's massive. That's the one you always. I mean, wow. As opposed to just a little thing in the ground. I mean, both significant, but the one that draws your attention is the big fancy one, right? Well, now we got the big fancy stuff happening over here with this one. All the pomp and circumstance, the guards, the seals, all the thing that's happening is going to stick out. But more than that, there's other facts that shows that the disciples were already familiar. For example, the detailed records about the burial of Jesus show that the disciples knew about the tomb and its location. See, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, who did they say owned the tomb? You guys remember? Joseph of Arimathea, right? So they knew that. That's recorded. Also, the number of people involved, even Peter and John and the tomb's owner, rules out the possibility that all were mistaken. Also, the tomb was marked and clearly identifiable by an official seal on the guard. So we already talked about that. And again, the officials would certainly have corrected such an obvious error. So it's not a legitimate claim. In fact, it's terribly weak. Another objection that's thrown out there to the validity of the empty tomb reports is the claim that Jesus was not really dead when they laid him in the tomb. You guys ever heard this one? What's it called? What's the nickname? Yeah, swoon theory. That's what this one's called, swoon theory. So, again, I don't know if you guys have ever seen The Princess Bride, right? If you haven't, you need to. It's in the Bible. But the fellow's mostly dead. He's not all dead. You know, all right, if you don't, most of you are looking at me like I'm crazy. A couple of you, God bless you for knowing that. So, that's basically what they said, that Jesus was simply just in a catatonic state, that he wasn't really dead. Now, is that he wasn't really dead. Now, he obviously, this is what they say, he revived, got out of the tomb on his own, and went off to die in secret. That's the theory. The shape he was in, what he had gone through, got out. Yeah, fought off the guard and went off to die alone. And then never to be found. That's the theory. Yeah, I mean that was their job. I mean, they were professional executioners. Again, back to the Princess Bride, there was a guy who was really good at it, but I'm not going to keep going there. All right, so again, this is contrary to all the data related to Jesus' last days. By the time he was buried, think about everything. Let's go back to the night that he was betrayed. So we know that it was at night. What condition was he in the Garden of Gethsemane? Yeah, so he was physically, emotionally, spiritually under so much that sweat was as drops of blood, right? This, you know, what that does to a person. So that's how he started out all this. From there, did it get better? No, I mean, without sleep, trial after trial, beaten and beaten and beaten, and then hung on a cross. So he was weak from sleeplessness, from scourging and the ordeal of the crucifixion. Thus, a resuscitation is physically implausible. A Christian physician, Dr. Garland Baer, has noted that the bodily fluids lost via sweat in Gethsemane and not replaced would have resulted in shock once the body was laid in the cool tomb. Thus, even if Jesus were only in a coma at the time, the burial would have killed him, not revived him. We should also remember that Jesus' side had been pierced, yielding blood and water, which is also an indication of death. Also, an experienced Roman centurion certified Jesus' death. In addition, the burial process included being tightly wrapped in strips of cloth that were packed with 75 to 100 pounds of spices. Then a huge stone was placed and sealed to block the tomb's entrance, after which a guard was stationed at the entrance. The authorities would have made sure the body was still there when this was done, when the tomb was sealed. What's that? I believe. Now we must ask, would a man in such a weak and diminished state have had the physical strength necessary to escape from such a sealed and protected tomb? And even if he did revive and exit from the tomb, could he have had the positive psychological impact his disciples that would have been necessary to fill them with the zeal that they later exhibited? So, if this is what really happened, and we understand, we're going to talk about other effects later on, so this is kind of jumping ahead, but the effect it had upon the people that saw this moving forward, if they never saw a risen Jesus, would they have changed their entire lives? So we need to think about this as well. So, see, even if he did revive and exit from the tomb, could he have had the positive psychological impact on his disciples that would have been necessary to fill them with the zeal that they later exhibited? Such a scenario would have been religiously implausible. And that is a quote from William Lane Craig. Now, a final implausible explanation for the empty tomb report is a suggestion that someone must have stolen Jesus' body out of the tomb. Right? This is called the conspiracy theory. But who would have done this? Jesus' enemies certainly lacked the inclination to steal it. That wouldn't have been, his enemies, no, keep them in there. And then his friends lacked both the inclination and the opportunity. Finally, the fact that the grave cloths were left behind and remained intact is hardly consistent with the theft of a body. Right? So we're going to neatly take them out of the cloths, fold them neatly, and leave them in the tomb as we're conducting this heist. Not really plausible. In the end, the very silence of the Jews and of Jesus' other enemies proves the tomb is empty. In fact, we have the record that was going to be their explanation, that this was their cover-up story. The Jewish officials and the Roman officials, that they were going to say, this was their story, that they were going to say that the body was stolen. That's what they were doing. But they have no evidence to back it up. Now, so their silence speaks. Now, they certainly would have produced the body if that had been possible. So if they could have produced the body, they would have. Also, the public proclamation of the resurrection implied an empty tomb. And anyone could have checked if he were inclined, yet no opposing testimony prevailed. The bottom line is that the only sufficient and reasonable explanation for all the data is that the tomb in which Jesus was buried was really empty, and that its emptiness was the result of his bodily resurrection. That is the most reasonable explanation for the evidence. Now, let's look at another effect. Reports concerning Jesus' appearances. So not only do we have reports of the empty tomb, we have many reports of the fact that I just saw him. I ate fish with him. I touched the scars in his hands. All these reports, we have to have an explanation for them. What is the sufficient cause for this effect, these reports? So the second main example of effect for which the bodily resurrection of Jesus is the only sufficient cause is likewise a series of reports coming from eyewitnesses in the days following Jesus' crucifixion and burial. So not only do we have eyewitness reports of an empty tomb, we have eyewitness reports of a risen Jesus. This time the effect that requires explaining is his disciples' testimony or reports about the appearances of Christ after his death and burial. Now the Apostle Paul mentions a few of these in 1 Corinthians 15, 5 through 8. Yes, my favorite chapter in the Bible. So Eric actually incorporated this into his sermon. 1 Corinthians 15 has a breakdown of the gospel as a whole, and it talks about the appearances. So, beginning in verse 3, "For I delivered to you as of first importance, which I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures." And now the appearances. "And that he appeared to Cephas," who's that? Yep. "Then to the 12, and that he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom remain until now, but some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. And last of all, as it were to one untimely born, he appeared to me also." We're going to talk about, it's funny how James is singled out here, and we're going to talk about why here in a minute. So, Paul mentions a few of these appearances where he says that after Jesus died and buried, he appeared to Peter, and then all that we read there. The Gospels record other appearances in addition to these. The question is, how can these reports be explained? Only one explanation can sufficiently account for these many reports, namely, the fact that Jesus did indeed rise from the dead following his death and burial. Now again, we're going to emphasize the fact that we're talking about the reports, about seeing the risen Christ, that are the effects which require an explanation, and which in the end can be explained only by the fact of Jesus' actual resurrection. It is assuming too much to begin with the appearances themselves and to ask how we may explain the appearances. It is sufficient to ask how we may explain the reports. So we're focusing on the reports. Now, to be sure, unbelievers have vainly tried to this. You think the empty tomb stuff is a little wacky? This is where it gets really fun, because now they have to explain, well, I guess they believe they really saw something, so now we got to come up with a reason why. That's not that he rose from the dead. And so these explanations are out there. So let's look at these reports, or these that have tried to conjure up other ways to explain. What are their alternate explanations? For example, some have tried to explain the reports of Jesus' appearances through what they call psychologically, simply as wish fulfillment, or as hallucinations brought on by intense desire and expectation. So what they're saying is that all these reports can be explained by the fact that people wanted him and wished for him to have risen from the dead, so much so that they corporately hallucinated the same thing. Now, group hallucinations all seeing the exact same thing in multiple times and places, ever been recorded anywhere else, even in the presence of mind-altering things? No. See, this kind of explanation is grossly inadequate. However, because the records show that the disciples' post-crucifixion attitude was just the opposite of this. So what was their attitude after Jesus was buried in the tomb? It's going to happen. I know it's going to happen. I know it. I'm going to go there and wait and watch. It's going to happen at any moment. Is that what they did? What did they do? They had a woe is me party back at the place, right? It's over. It's done. We're toast. We're done. It was completely contrary to where they were psychologically. Rather than positive feelings of confidence and assurance and expectation, their attitude was one of despair. They were filled with disbelief, sorrow, and discouragement. Also, the very circumstances of the appearance preclude hallucination. This is true because there were many in number, 11 are reported, in quite different variety, all the different appearances, over a period of a number of days. Hallucinations and other kinds of subjective experiences are usually very private and individual, but the audiences who witnessed Jesus' appearance often consisted of many at the same time, up to 500. Also, the appearances were limited, except for the unique one to Saul of Tarsus, to a specific 40-day period. We should also note, as James Orris pointed out, that the appearances involved not fleeting glimpses, but prolonged interviews. So this just wasn't like, I think I saw him walk through the trees. Right? No, like Bigfoot. Right? Or the Loch Ness. No, this was interactions, speaking, interviewing, sitting down and eating together. It was very personal, completely inconsistent with hallucination. One other reported fact is inconsistent with the hallucination explanation of the appearance is this: Jesus' tomb was empty. Got to remember that. Another attempt to explain the reports of Jesus appearing to various individuals following his death and burial can be called a parapsychological explanation. Now, I've never heard of this one. But apparently there was okay, so let's talk about what this is. Parapsychological. It is suggested that only Jesus' spirit, not his risen body, appeared to the apostles and others. Now, if you know what happened in the late first century, was a heresy that was coming up called Gnosticism, right? And Gnosticism said that one possibility about Jesus is that he was just spirit. He was basically an apparition, right? And the other said, no, it was all body, no spirit. The two couldn't exist in Gnosticism. But this is not what we're talking about here. This is from a guy in 1959. It's not based in Gnostic thought at all. In fact, I don't even know why he would even try to go there. But this guy offered this unusual denial of the resurrection, was a famous preacher and theologian named Leslie Weatherhead. Anybody heard of him? Leslie Weatherhead? He wasn't that famous. All right. So he offered this idea. Listen to this. He says that in the tomb, the physical body of Christ completely evanesced. You know, like plop, plop, fizz, fizz, and the evanescence bubbles, right? Right? Or evaporated or dematerialized. Probably through the speeding up of molecular movement, became gaseous and escaped through the chinks in the cave. This is what this guy thought. This really deserves no attention at all. I'm just reading it to you because I think it's amusing. He says, we cannot explain how this happened. Maybe it was a one-time miracle. Maybe we will one day, through scientific or psychic research, discover how it was done. Nevertheless, afterward, Christ appeared in a spiritual or etheric form, which only had the appearance of matter and the appearance of sound, reaching the brain centers of sight and sound and touch by routes other than those of the sensory nervous system. This is garbage. Why you would even go there? Why would you even try to go there?
It's interesting that his explanation is even more complicated than it just puts life back into the body.
Yeah, it makes no sense. So, and you're probably thinking, anyone who would conjure up such a weird explanation of the accounts of Jesus' post-burial appearances must be awfully desperate. to explain away the resurrection. You would be correct, of course. But in case you were tempted to accept such an explanation, which I know you're not, you need to realize that it is completely inconsistent with the data included in these accounts. So we don't even really need to do this. We know that Jesus ate food and was touched, things that require a body. In fact, he did these things for the very purpose. Jesus did these things on purpose of proving that he was not just a spirit. See, if Weatherhead were right, then that makes Jesus a deceiver. Because Jesus claimed to be bodily resurrected. And if he really wasn't, then that makes Jesus a deceiver, so that's no good either. Anyway, so let's look at another unsatisfactory attempt to explain away the reports of Jesus' appearances, is the familiar appeal to deceit. So once again, we're back to conspiracy to lying. Those who reported that they saw the risen Christ were simply lying. But again, we must insist lying would have been inconsistent with the disciples' character and high moral teaching, and, I think more importantly, with their zeal and their willingness to face martyrdom. Think about this. So, the reports of the empty tomb, the reports, the witnesses of the resurrected Jesus Christ all lead up to the day of Pentecost when Peter preaches. And he says, everything you've seen, these prophecies have been fulfilled in this day and in the person of Jesus Christ. David's in his tomb over there. Jesus is not in his tomb. We saw him. He rose from the dead. And that day the church began as over 3,000 were baptized into Jesus Christ for the forgiveness of their sins. And from that moment forward, they completely... Now, who were the ones gathered there that day? Jews, right? Did their lives change after this day? Yeah. What did they... one of the most... Well, I'm kind of jumping the gun here. But all those, from that point forward, including the apostles and others who had witnessed Jesus risen or had testimony from someone, they talked to someone who saw. So, I mean, that's pretty reliable, right? When you have a number of people that are testifying that Jesus rose from the dead. They completely changed the way they live their lives. These are Jewish people now that are no longer going to the synagogues or the temple on Saturday, are now meeting on Sunday. You think that's a big deal? That's a very big deal. They're completely changing their life. No longer going to do the sacrifices. Not doing that anymore. We're completely changing everything we're doing. And eventually, people like Paul, or should I say Saul, are going to hunt us down and try to kill us. For a lie? Do you think that some of the people that Paul hunted down actually saw Jesus risen from the dead? It's quite possible. Could have been some of those 500. Or that they were in that direct communication with those that did. So it's not just the apostles who were martyred. There were Jews that were saved on the day of Pentecost who probably gave up their life as well to the Jews who were seeking to exterminate them. For a lie? Would have to be somewhere in that group, would have to be, the number of them, of these reports, of all these witnesses, they would all have to be lying the same way, saying the same thing. They themselves continued to lie, if they were lying, convinced others to change their lives, and then convinced them to be martyrs too. That makes a lot of sense, right? No. Oh, yeah.
Not only that, unlike these modern cults, there was no self-enrichment.
Oh, no, yeah. How did...
There's not a plausible incentive for these people to continue other than they believe this man rose from the dead.
Let's talk about Saul himself, right? How were things prior to meeting Jesus on the Damascus Road, right? An official, well-respected, married, home, probably had a ton of money. And what do we read about his life as the Apostle Paul? Basically broke, had to work and build tents just to get by, just to eat. Jail, in the deep, snake bitten, beaten to the point of death numerous times for a lie? I mean, come on. Now, we're talking about a lot of inconsistencies if you're trying to say this was all for a lie. See, we must insist lying would have been inconsistent with the disciples' character and high moral teaching, with their zeal and their willingness to face martyrdom. Also, as is often noted, records with made-up stories about such appearances would show more evidence of such fabrication. See, if this was all made up, I guarantee you this, in the Jewish worldview, the women would not have been the ones to go first to the tomb. Because, now, it's sad to say, but in that culture, Roman culture, Jewish culture at that time, women's testimony wasn't worth much. So we're not going to hang our hats on that. But, and this is another way that the Bible's showing it's elevating women, their testimony was completely valid. In fact, Jesus himself confirmed their testimony as being legitimate for belief. So they wouldn't have made that up, that the women got there first. Edwin Yamauchi says, the fact that the first appearances of the risen Christ were not to the apostles but instead to the women was actually quite striking. And again, trying to explain the appearance reports as deliberate deceit seems to forget the tomb is empty after all. Some think that the reports of Christ's post-resurrection appearances are questionable because it seems that all of his appearances were to believers. If he really did rise from the dead, why did he not appear to unbelievers such as Herod or Pilate? Would that not have been more productive both from the standpoint of evangelism and apologetics? Now, two comments are relevant here. First, Jesus did in fact appear to some unbelievers. Who were some unbelievers that Jesus appeared to? We just named one. Saul. Was Saul a believer? Yeah. His brother James was not a believer. James is listed here, though, as one that he appeared to because he did. James, we understand this in Acts chapter 15, the Council of Jerusalem, that James is the one that stood up and set everything right. James, the half-brother of Jesus, became a pillar in the early church. He eventually believed. Why did he eventually believe? And it said before he didn't. Because he saw the risen Christ. He appeared to James and Jude, Saul of Tarsus second, and more significantly, Jesus' main purpose in making these appearances was not to make converts, but to prepare the believers to proclaim his resurrection to the unbelieving world. This is seen in Acts chapter 10, verses 40 through 42, says this, God raised him up on the third day and granted that he became visible not to all the people, but to witnesses who were chosen beforehand by God. That's an incredible statement that I wish we could spend time on that. Could you imagine that you were one of the ones that were chosen beforehand by God to witness the resurrected Christ? Whew, that's pretty cool. Right? That is, to us who ate and drank with him after he arose from the dead, and he ordered us to preach to the people and solemnly to testify that this is the one who had been appointed by God as judge of the living and the dead. Our conclusion must be the only sufficient explanation for the reports concerning the various appearances of Christ following his death and burial is that he actually rose from the dead. Now, we're out of time, and we're going to finish this up next week. But I want to talk to you about something that I never thought of in this way. But I'm going to throw it out there for you and give you a chance to think about it this week. When we talk about something is an apologetic, like something that serves as a proof for the existence of God, or proof for the resurrection of Christ, or a proof for this or that or the other, right? I never thought of this as an apologetic, the Lord's Supper. So you can think about that this week. In what way? All right, any questions, comments?